absolutely delighted to welcome Phil Scully, as Emma said, CIO at leading beverage brand Costa and also formerly Group CTO at Whitbread. Phil has 30 years experience leading huge transformational technology change across large organizations such as BAA, Centrica, M&S. You don't get much bigger than some of those. And so good morning to you, Phil, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, thank you, good to be here.
So we are going to talk about automation in just 1 minute. We know it's a very important area of spend. About a quarter of people mentioned that in our own digital trends report this year. Before we get into that, Phil, I want to ask about you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background. 30 years is a long time in any industry, but it's definitely a long time in technology. So it'd be interesting to understand, I guess, a bit about your background and how that has informed some of your thinking.
Thank you. Yeah. So, wow. I mean, my technology transformation journey started way back when. But if you roll it back to the early 2000s at BAA at the airports, the technology was all about booking car park spaces, passenger visibility on a timely fashion across the airport, integrating systems with Terminal 5. Lots of merger and acquisition type backgrounds, and I think there'll be a lot of merger acquisition type behaviors coming out of coronavirus. But with Centrica, it was all about taking small business systems and merging those into a large business brand under the Centrica banner. M&S was 6 years very much around multi-channel transformation, and I'm sure a number of people on the call have been on that journey already, and that's one of convenience and visibility to the customer of what your brand has to offer and the promise that you make. And I guess that's continued through Whitbread and Costa. And my 3 years at Costa have been, again, interesting merge acquisition activity after the Coca-Cola purchase of Costa. And it's quite telling that the separation from Whitbread took less than 15 months for all of our systems. And literally the last system went over the line and went live, dedicated to Costa on March the 9th. We became a fully cloud-only organization in the UK business. And 7 days later, we went into full business continuity testing, and followed a week after that by lockdown, and a week after that by the first payroll. And so the pace of change and the ability for Costa to have those systems in the cloud and change at pace and respond at pace, I think has been very, very apparent, telling and timely, given where we are now. And Emma was right. Hugely testing times for any business, hugely worrying times for anybody out there, and hugely difficult times for families who are dealing with loved ones falling sick, and the ability for anybody to deal with those challenges at pace, with clarity and ownership of decision is going to be a key thing going forward. And that's I guess what we're talking about this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Phil, thank you so much. What a few months it's been, and some incredible experiences there for you to share with people. So, I mean, thinking a little bit towards automation, as you say, because that's potentially going to be an important part of, I guess, recovery and repositioning for people. And we'll dive into that a little bit. For everybody that's just joining and just logging on, I just want to remind you that there is a Q&A function on your screens. So if you want to ask Phil questions, if you just type your question in there, then we will hopefully be able to get through quite a lot of those, because I imagine that even just that introduction, Phil, has already sparked a lot of thinking. So if we just focus on the pandemic at the moment, and we kind of start there, how do you think that is changing thinking on and prospects for automation?
Look, I think it's changing. I think it's changing thinking in a number of ways. I think retailers and the high street have thought about for a long time multi-channel, and the ability of joining up a website to a store, and the convenience of doing that from a consumer point of view. And maybe that's happened in a number of places to the detriment, or the lack of investment in some areas on the B2B and the supply chain and the partnerships point of view. And you've got to start thinking about the consumer promise from end to end. Where does the product start and where does the product finish? And you know, there's been so many headlines about the supply chains that have started in China when China were already in lockdown. So how do you get visibility of that and make decisions about that, and make a forward move, make a progress move if that supply chain is compromised? And that automation has to consider the end-to-end promise, not just the turn-up promise from a website or a store. And I think the scale that automation now will be considered in, of not just a little piece of a process or a point to point of a process, but the entirety of the process, I think will be a very different set of conversations coming out of this. And I think where automation includes human touch now, and we say it's automated because a human has interacted with a system to do a thing that is then automated. I think that will start to shift. I think the longer we stay in isolation and lockdown behaviors, the more habit forming they're going to be, and the more nervous people are going to be on the exit from these situations. Because if there isn't vaccine, if there is still social distancing, if you're still living in a community where everybody's wearing masks, people aren't going to want to touch a kiosk as much. People aren't going to want to necessarily think about handling something somebody else has handled. So automation, I think, will be considered in a how to touch it less, and whether that's the rise of facial recognition technologies, the rise of voice recognition technologies and voice ordering, the rise of proximity technologies with mobile devices being the order point, but I'm the only one touching my smartphone rather than handing it over to a member of store team. Those are three that would provide a lower touch way of working, a lower touch automation approach. And I think those are going to start to come through in a number of different places.
Thank you. I mean, there's some tremendous opportunities, I suppose, to change things then amongst all of the crises that are happening. Before we focus on sort of retail specifically, and maybe look at maybe some repositioning there, I did want to talk about frontline workers, because it strikes me that there's been quite a lot of focus in some communities about remote working. Clearly, you know, that's something that lots of people are having to do, and not being able to go into an office. There are also lots of people out there still doing their jobs out there on the front line. And I wonder, do you sort of feel that automation has a role to play in making their work safer in the longer term as we start to kind of come out of this?
Yeah, I think so. I think safer and simpler. I think from just where we are now, the ability to automate systems at the back end and to support an entire workforce working from home, working remotely. You know, every organisation in the UK has taken a corporate office of 1,000 people or a corporate of 100 people and turned it into 100 offices or 1,000 offices. And so the ability to connect, the ability to move files, the ability to move information between those 1,000 or 100 offices is automation. It's system to system rather than people to people. And that connectivity and automation, I think, will bring a level of safety and comfort to people, because they have a choice, that they don't have to go into the office. They can attend virtually if they have health concerns. They can stay at home. you know, I think just the impact people have not had on the environment by being isolated, again, is another habit coming out of this, that people might not want to commute as much. They might not want to see as much traffic on the road. There might not be the demand to travel the way there has been in the past, because, you know, the pictures tell their own story in terms of just the last couple of weeks and the difference that's made. And there's health and safety of everybody involved in some of those decisions, habits, and conversations. So I think those will continue. If you come down to service and frontline service, it's the same conversations as consumers. You've got to look after your people and look after your teams, and make sure the health, safety, and welfare of the people working for your business is at the forefront of all the decisions that you make. And if you're looking at contactless type technologies and less touch type services for consumers, then those kind of technologies, that kind of thinking, has to go into what you deliver to run and operate the business, and how you look after your teams. And whether that's things like voice recognition signatures for goods coming inbound rather than handling and signing on glass, whether there's mechanisms to be able to do a stock check of a shelf in a supermarket without physically handling and counting, but just look at that, take a picture, look at that through a different lens, quite literally, and not have to touch, not have to handle. I think those thinkings and those things are not there in terms of a technology that fully covers that end to end yet. But I think that's the kind of thing that will be thought about coming through, and organizations are going to have to start thinking about some of that automation.
And I think that brings us to a really interesting point. And this is where your experience of scale, we're talking massive scale and large projects, I think is really helpful, because if you want to implement something like that kind of initiative at scale, what are just some of the things that you have to consider to make that successful?
Wow. I mean, you've got to be able to do it in the first place. So you have to make sure that it's not just technically that it works, but it operationally works for the business and the teams, that it works for the consumer, that it actually supports and simplifies the promise and removes friction, and then adds to the convenience of that experience and that promise. But then you roll it forward, and you know, for someone like Costa in the UK, we have to roll it forward to over 1,500 stores in different formats. So you have to think about connectivity, you have to think about scale, you have to think about mornings being busier than afternoons, or evenings being busier than lunchtimes, if depending on the business profile that you have. That is on-demand compute, that is cloud, that is software as a service. Those tools are out there, but you know, the ability to execute those at pace nationally and or internationally is enormous. And then increasingly, it has to be repeatable for franchises. The consumer doesn't care. Consumer doesn't care whether KFC, Costa, McDonald's is an owned business or a franchise business. They are there for the brand. They are there for the product the brand sells, and the promise of that product being quality, and the same regardless of the store they walk into. So any technology at scale has to be supportable by a franchise model.
Thinking about some of the IT transformation initiatives, I suppose, that were taking place pre-COVID, and what the priorities might be now. Do you think that anything is going to be particularly accelerated? Do you think things might be on the table that weren't a few months ago? What's your sort of feeling about that?
Yeah, look, there's I think the panel was on LinkedIn, and one of them was who's driving digital transformation in your organization, the CEO, the CIO, or COVID-19. And I think that most people would probably tick the third box. I think you've then got the other old adage of never waste a crisis, and I think everybody in the UK has been working in crisis mode to figure out some of these impacts, close down their businesses, move their teams to work from home models. And I think that now is the time to think about how you come out of lockdown and isolation, what that looks like, and the kind of capabilities that either started to come through and will be accelerated, or that are going to be needed. I think we've covered some of the ones that should be being thought about, I think, if nothing else, for the future. But I think where, certainly in the UK, you look at things like the collect services, you look at things like Uber Eats, Deliveroo, and the massive growth of delivery services to the front door. A lot of those businesses are still trading. You can still get a pizza delivered from Domino's. Those kind of services, I think, will be ones that are accelerated, and I think organizations are probably looking at accelerating those now.
Thank you for that. I mean, I guess that also brings us to another point. It's figuring out your strategy and what to do in this new world, and then there's kind of leading through that. And in terms of execution and leadership, any particular skills there that you feel are really important to help sort of drive forward maybe an automation strategy or a revised digital strategy in light of these changing conditions? I mean, you've done it a few times. What's worked?
So I think the two for me, I think progress, not perfection. I think operating at pace. I think, whether you call it the 80-20 rule, I personally like progress, not perfection, but the ability to get something out there, learn from it, adapt to it, change. We call it agile, we call it wagile, we call it lots of different things, but it is it is just the ability to get something done and iterate it. I think that is progress, not perfection. And I think the ability to do that at scale is hugely important going forward. And then I think the other one is what else? It's human nature to resist change, and yet everybody has just gone through the most massive fundamental changes to their lifestyles and ways of living over the last 4 to 5 weeks. But if you've got 9-10 changes hitting you, accepting the 10th or the 11th change is kind of easier most of the time. So we looked at our transformation agenda with Costa and the separation from Whitbread following the acquisition. We moved out of all of our legacy systems. We took that opportunity to take a massive step change and move everything onto cloud services and become a cloud-only organization. That wasn't originally that wasn't one of the front 9 or 10 things we had to do, but it was an easier thing to achieve because of the other 9 or 10 things that were already needing to be done. And I think looking for those opportunities, just sitting back, taking a moment and saying, what else can be done whilst we're digging up the road? Sometimes I wish they'd do that around here a bit more. While we're digging up the road, what else can we put down? What else can be done? I think is a very good discipline and a very good time to take when you're doing these things.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, that is really invaluable experience, and actually I think really helpful to help people think positively amongst all the business continuity planning and change, and see change as a positive. I want to come to some questions in just a second. I'd really encourage everyone, I'm sure that what Phil has said has sparked quite a lot of thinking. We've got a couple of questions to go to, but if you've got any more, please start typing them in now, and then I'll be able to submit them to Phil. Has an absolute wealth of experience, and I'm just I'm very keen for you all to have the opportunity to get your questions in. I want to come to.
Just add,
yeah.
The third discipline, if I had to think of a third one, would be build momentum. Right, change can be daunting. Change at massive scale can be overwhelming sometimes if you look at it in terms of size and just the whole thing. So what can you do to build momentum, build confidence, build trust, take it back? What can you take back to the board and say, right, we've done this bit, we'll do the next bit, and build that stakeholder trust, that faith, that team momentum, team belief is hugely important. And I think being able to look at any change in that way, I think is a really good discipline to have.
Thank you. I think that if we're going to go to a question that Tom Segal has submitted, which looks really at sort of strategy more closely. Tom wants to know how you would advise around creating a business case or metrics, you know, for this approach, whether that's for automation or large scale transformations, because it makes business sense, like no touch options, but they can be notoriously difficult to quantify on a spreadsheet. And that is something that we hear all the time, certainly putting to CFOs, I know is an issue. What are your thoughts on that, Phil?
Well, I mean, some of this, you can start from some of the known things that we have now in our society, in our behaviors. We queue a lot. We queue a lot densely. Any business probably has people that can be seen leaving the back of a queue because they can't be bothered to queue. And we live in a time hungry, weight intolerant society. So start building the business case from there. And that queue time, that queue depth often does shout out for automation. And we've started these journeys. Everybody who's got a retail business has started these journeys. Cash moving to card moving to contactless moving from 30 to 45 pounds. All of those things are about pace. All of those things are about removing queue time, queue depth. Start there. And I think moving on from that, just have a look at the behaviors of try and find out where businesses are coming out of lockdown or countries are coming out earlier. People are people. Doesn't matter whether you're Chinese, American, European, African. You put an invisible virus that kills your loved ones in the mix and forces people to think about touching, forces people to think about standing near others. Behavior is the same. The people won't want to queue. So if there's learnings you can take from other societies, other territories, other businesses coming back, and see if that comes through, because there's going to be commonality in terms of behaviors or responses to those behaviors. I think coming out the other side, that will also help build a business case.
And in a similar vein, we've got another question from Tommy Cloherty, who I think has joined us for a few of these. And this is a great question. PPE seems to have exposed weaknesses in the supply chain, but also a new spirit of collaboration between competitors, which you know I don't think we've seen before. Can this be sustained, or will we go back to business as normal?
Wow, I mean, it's a great question. I think I think that there could be a closer collaboration in the future, or closer set of partnerships with organizations that are not necessarily competitively overlapped, but who have requirements or need in common, whether that's sharing supply chain because they don't have competition, or they're complementary and there's cost savings and efficiencies there, or sharing a supplier because people will be looking to get PPE out. Depending on legislation, there's a lot of conversation in the last 48 hours about mandate for masks, whether there's a mandate for gloves. Germany certainly seems to be coming back with a mandate for masks. Those kind of new supply chains, those new requirements, they're not really competitive. They don't make a difference to anything other than humans in the business and teams, and we can all have a far more humanity coming out of this than maybe we did going into this. And I think that will stimulate people to think differently about some of those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. To move away slightly from the current situation, I've got a question here from Phil Holt, and this is about resistance to change. Other than people's resistance to change, what were the other key challenges or issues that you faced with the migration away from Whitbread and the project as a whole? Is there anything to highlight there?
Yeah, so I think the couple of things, again, you've got to think about how you break it down. Separating and exiting from a large organization is very complex. There are so many moving parts. So putting it into phases and bite-sized chunks as that capability changes between technologies, sometimes it's network, sometimes it's application, you might need different skills, but being able to look through that as a series of phases or capabilities is really important. I think don't be afraid to turn things off. Our instinct, our human instinct, is often to hoard, and I don't know how many organizations have got umpteen years of data they never use. It's like clearing out your attic. Turn it off, shut it down. Do you really need to move it? Because a lot of the time, the timeline, the time lag on some of these is moving legacy and trying to figure out how a 15-year-old technology works in a 15-year technology environment. Those decisions, I think, can really accelerate the pace.
Thank you. A couple more on strategy, different elements now. So Simon Green has submitted a question and he'd like you to say a few words about Agile, sort of to what extent you've used it in IT developments, cloud migration, and to what extent you encourage an Agile philosophy in the business.
So we've used Agile a lot. We've in-housed our development engineering functions. We now have capability to deliver at pace. We've moved from, irregular deliveries to literally daily and weekly drops of what we want to do and the code we want to change. And you have to do that with whether it's as simple as a product change or a price change, all the way up to next version of mobile app or website. Those disciplines are important, and we've used those within Costa to drive a very different pace of change and a very different quality of change into our services, whether they are through the baristas in the stores or directly to the consumer's hands. I think it's hugely important to have that mindset of operating at pace. It is a differentiator. It is definitely seen as a differentiator by business. Certainly, the separation and the work that we've done in Costa, if we hadn't operated and executed at the pace we did, we'd be in a different place now, I think, with our technology completely and our ability to meet the demands of the business in these unparalleled times. So having the mindset of move at pace, governance with a little g, not a big G, right? Don't be afraid to empower your teams and make them have those decision rights that they need if you're going to move at pace, and look at how that is going to be supported through the business. Because you're going to make mistakes. You're going to move at pace. You're going to make mistakes. If you're not making some of those mistakes, sometimes you have to stand back and think, well, are we actually challenging ourselves hard enough on pace? Because those metrics are often in opposition. So I think you have to build that culture, but it will ultimately take time, because you come back to building the belief, building the momentum, building the behaviors, and sometimes just writing it down as a strategy is dead easy. But actually changing it and moving it as a cultural thing into the organization can take a much longer time.
Thanks, Phil. And actually, we've got a good question here from Alex Lloyd, just to summarise, because this relates to Agile, and this approach requires frontline staff feeding back into the project, lessons learned, so things can be iterated and change rapidly, as you said. But we're now working in a different environment with a geographically separated frontline teams and various other conditions. I guess, does that change things? How does that change things?
I think it does change things. I mean, I can't be the only person who hasn't really moved from what you see now for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I think, but it's in our nature to want to talk. It's in our nature to want to interact or collaborate. So I think people will always find a way to communicate. And there's 50 plus people on this call now. The ability to get in touch, to talk to people, to share a screen and talk people through things has never been easier. But it is just that we've never really probably tested some of these muscles before. Right? I cannot be the only CIO now who is running entire programs remotely with distributed teams. Whereas we've spent a lifetime previously assuming that our entire project had to sit together all the time, and even to the point of finding a brand new building for the project to live in for the lifetime of the project. Well, maybe you don't need to do as much of that anymore because the tools have always been there, certainly for the last few years. We're just now using them daily, hourly to get the job done. Progress, not perfection.
Absolutely. One last question, and then we'll wrap up. And this is from Will Silverwood, who's asking about internal change capabilities and whether, with the nature and pace of change that businesses are going through, that more of them are actually building internal change capabilities rather than seeking kind of external transformation specialists to come in. What's the balance there in your view?
So for me, the balance is what's important to the business, right? The thing you have to think about is what does the consumer see? What's a hygiene factor? What's a convenience? And then what is an actual service that is part of a transaction with the consumer, that is part of your brand proposition or brand promise? And if it's part of your brand proposition or brand promise, then you should probably think about how you bring that more closely aligned to the business, and probably more internal resource, skills, capability, and ownership than external, because that just gives you a bit more of an edge, a bit more momentum, a bit more understanding of the business. You don't go to the next supplier and immediately have a 3 to 6 month due diligence phase of finding out how the business runs and what it does. You've got some internal skills that have lived it and breathed it. And sometimes if you get the chance, and it's certainly been hugely valuable to the IT team, people coming from the business into IT with not necessarily all of the technical skills, but project management, project delivery skills, the ability to understand the rollout impact and the business change impact of a system on operations, the ability to understand how the day job is changed by a system changing. From a business analysis point of view, is hugely powerful, hugely useful. So not just trying to think about IT skills for IT teams, but how do you get some of that good cross-skilled function moving is massively important, but definitely more think about brand promise consumer than network server hosting and cloud from that in-source outsource conversation.
Absolutely, and I think so many of these things can be applied to some of these large scale automation initiatives that people have the ambition to do. One last question. This has just come through, and I really just want to ask this because we're going to end on cloud, which was not my intention, but this is a great question from Paul. Sort of mentioning how recently you've moved all of your legacy systems to the cloud. When there's a need to move at speed, this move has huge advantages. But do you see an advantage of recent cloud movers versus the earlier adopters of cloud architectures at all?
Great question. I think it's not necessarily recent versus legacy. I think for me, it's what you do. It's having the tools and the ability to automate within the cloud. So the ability to copy, spool up, containerize in an automated, repeatable fashion, I think is important and makes the difference regardless of what phase of adoption that you're in. I think the other thing for consideration is probably more around how those clouds are managed and supported. If they're supported in a single place, and it comes back to the automation and tooling, supported and transparent from a single source rather than multiple different suppliers and vendors, I think that also does provide a measure of difference as well.
Phil, thank you so much. I've managed to fire a lot of questions at you, and I know some of them were pretty challenging, and lots of really useful insights there. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I know that people need 5 minutes before their 9 o'clock start and that kind of thing. I want to say a huge thank you to you. I think that what this has shown is that your experience is really valuable, and thank you so much for taking the time to answer everybody's questions and to join us and get people's day off to a start, I think, with some positive things that they can think about with respect to their own projects and those challenges. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. So I really hope everybody's enjoyed this session this morning. Thank you so much for joining in. This is episode 4. If you've enjoyed this, we're going to be running some more breakfasts. I'll be here every Thursday with a different guest disruptor, and we'll be culminating at the end with a finale on the 2nd of June, which will be our Chief Disruptor Live virtual event. There'll be lots of interesting things, lots of more stories of disruption and coping with change. And we really want to connect you and other like-minded people and disruptors to help you push things forward at this particularly difficult time.